And I kind of wanted to speak, well, I definitely want to speak to you about a bit about what I spoke last time, and just to fill some of you in who weren't here. I don't know how long ago, it was quite a few months ago now, but I spoke about conversational intimacy with God. So just about that whole, how we can have a conversation. Prayer is about us speaking to him and then we hear him back, and about that total, and how we should bring everything, even the stuff that is minor, to him and hear back, because that's what relationship is. That's what we have with our friends and our spouses and our parents, hopefully, and all those things. So that's what we should have first and foremost with God. And it kind of also, I want to flow, Daniel spoke last time we were here, and he spoke about chaos and the chaos that comes at us. And I was thinking about these things, and I felt like God said to me, one form of that chaos in slightly more detail, are those voices that we hear, and the voices that come at us all the time. So I just wanted to speak today about the voices that we hear, and our interpretation of those voices, because that's a massive big deal. Yeah. So, and there are lots of voices, and I think there are probably many more than this, but there are 3 voices that I really felt God said, these are the ones I want you to speak about. And I'm hoping I'm not too long, and I kind of thought at first I shouldn't tell you there were 3 because you'll be counting them down. But we'll see.
35 minutes.
So I will go a bit quicker if I can.
I will start playing.
Yeah, cut me off at some point. Anyway, we'll see how we go. So the first voice I wanted to talk about was again the voice of God and the voice of Jesus, but not in the terms I was talking last time about us hearing him, but in the terms of in the Bible. And I'm not even wanting to talk about something particularly theological in this, about kind of what he was meaning behind this stuff particularly. What I want to talk about is the bits that we don't know, because it doesn't tell the tone that you hear his voice in, and it's more about his communication, I suppose, in his voice. What was he actually doing? What was his face doing? What was his, here I go now, but his gesticulation doing? What was that tone? What tone do you hear when you read it? And maybe a few years ago now, God started to say to me, you're not hearing me right. And it wasn't that I wasn't reading the Bible, right? I'm a perfectly literate person, but I didn't know the tone I was hearing was wrong. So I've chosen, I think actually I will, this is hardly short, I will just do one of the passages I think I was going to do. And if you want to turn to it, it's John 8, verses 1 to 11. Yes, I will. And it says, a minute, still hear rustling. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered round him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." I guess the first thing to say is don't pay any attention to the tones I use there. I did sit at home trying to practice voices. Did you say it like this? And I'm no actress, so I'm not going to go there. And I can't do a kind of Jewish, I don't know, Middle Eastern accent anyway, and especially not a man. So I'm not going to go there. So don't pay attention to how I did it. But pay attention to what your internal voice is saying, and the tone that your internal voice is giving. And this is a section that really speaks to me, and there may be other sections where you're hearing him wrong, but I think this is one for a while where the tone I heard was wrong. And in this bit, sorry, I'm a bit low down, there are 2 people that Jesus talks to in this section, or 2 groups of people. So there are the accusers that come in, and there is the woman. So if you first look at him speaking to the accusers, they come along, and they tell him why they're coming, and the Bible tells us that they were trying to catch him out. And Jesus at first doesn't even respond to this, so we do have some idea about his communication at this point, because he just bends down and writes on the sand, and we don't know what he writes, but he obviously wasn't doing exactly what they were expecting. I think at that point he didn't. And then they keep at him, and this is that chaos. This is where they try and get Jesus with the chaos of their voices. And it says, it says they continued to do it. And so I just imagine this kind of jabbering, come on Jesus, answer our question. They're jabbering and they're getting at him and they want to know. And then Jesus says to them, he says, if any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. And he silences those voices. And I don't know how he says it. I don't know if he shouts at them, or if he speaks just firmly, or whether he kind of like teases them, because he knows and they know that they're not without sin. Yeah. So actually, whether it's Jesus almost being slightly cheeky, almost being slightly humorous, I admit I don't hear that inside of myself, but I wonder. I think Jesus was a lot more humorous and a lot cleverer than a lot of the interpretations we take of him suggest. Yeah. And so it's just a question to ask yourself, how was he speaking and what was he doing? Was he wagging his finger? Was he demanding them, like, just go? Or was he more subtle? Because it sort of suggests right in the sand, that's quite subtle, that's what that suggests to me. Yeah. And I think the voice that you're hearing him with, when he says that, is probably the voice that you've heard your accusers with. Yeah. That's what I would suggest. Yeah. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous hearing Jesus with other people's voices, and we all do it. And it may be like a parental voice if you found them accusers. It may be those bullies at school. It could be that boss that kind of hassled you. It could be your spouse. It could be anything. But if you're hearing that accuser's voice from Jesus, then that's how you're going to swing that interpretation on who he is. And then that will carry into your relationship with him. Yeah. And then that's risky and that's dangerous, I think. And I think and this is where you've got to just really be self-reflective on what are you really hearing. He said these words, the Bible says it, and I totally believe it, but it's how he said it. Yeah. Yeah. And then the next person he speaks to is he speaks to the woman. And it says, "Woman, where are they? Have no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." And again, it's your own, we put our own swing on this. Like, I know this isn't how Jesus was saying it, but when I hear him call a woman, like, I have a problem with that. Yeah. In my culture, in who I am, I've been brought up in there. Like, Adam does not call me woman. And he knows what would happen if he did. So he does not call me woman. But I know that is my wrong take on this. That is like, I'm sure that's not how Jesus spoke to her. Because like, Jesus shouldn't have even been speaking to her. This is scandalous. He's standing there talking like to a woman anyway, being a Jewish teacher, and like, and what she'd just been doing. He should not be there on his own with this woman talking to her in the first place. So I don't think he was patronising or when he spoke to her. That doesn't match the situation. But you might hear him like that. I do struggle with hearing him call someone woman, and that's my take. And then he says, "Where are they? Has no one condemned you?" So when he says, "Has no one condemned you," is he shocked? Is that, even if you think, actually that doesn't work in the interpretations I've heard of this, but in my head, am I hearing him as being like, well, somebody should have, you were caught in the act? Is that what you're hearing because someone has done that to you? Or, when he say, "Has no one condemned you," is he kind of like, again, sort of being slightly cheeky? Because of course no one could condemn her. Is he winning her over? Is he inviting her to himself? Yeah. Because of course, like, they couldn't condemn her, and he was clever in his response earlier, and they both know that, so no one condemned her. And then he says, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." Now, particularly that "go now" bit, that could be a parent voice you could hear. You could hear this just like, "Go now and leave your life of sin." Almost like well, I'm being really kind to you, I'm a bit irritated with you really, you've been a bad girl, but I'm going to forgive you because I'm so good. Yeah. And do you hear that voice? Even if that's not what your head says that he was doing, you still might hear that voice. And again, if that's who you're hearing, or it could be a teacher, and like, I'm a teacher, and this is one of the real risks of being a teacher, the way you speak to children, they will carry, and you're really aware of that. And that could easily be a teacher saying something like that, "Just go now." It's like that kind of, "Just get out of my sight, I've had enough of you." And if you're hearing that again, that puts this barrier between you and Jesus. Yeah. And it's just so dangerous. I think that's just what I feel. Dangerous feels like a strong word, like a war zone word. Yeah. But like Lindsay said, we're in a war, and it's dangerous. So let's just kind of just get you thinking, and I think just when you're reading, to start thinking about, how am I interpreting this? What am I actually hearing when he says this? Okay. Now the The next voice I wanted to talk about that you hear is it sort of links with what Daniel spoke about, the chaos, and he touched on something where he said like you might have had this kind of chaotic morning, and then you might go to school and give someone else a chaotic look. I think he said like he and Alison might have an argument. I think is how he put it. And Alison might come to school and give me this look because she sees me at the school gates, and then I go away with this interpretation that I've annoyed Alison, or that we're not friends anymore, or all this sort of stuff you carry. Daniel spoke about that chaos last time, that we hear other people's voices. And this is massive, or even not their voices, their communication, shall we say, their communication to us. And that's massive, so I'm only going to really touch on this, but I think it had to be said that it's not worth probably putting any interpretation on that. I think it's the safest place to go. Like, just don't interpret what the other person said, or if you want to go there, and if you think, like, mine and Alison's relationship is obviously really important, it's really important for the shack, so if that did happen, the best thing I could do, I believe, is to go to Jesus and say to him, what was that about? What do I do with this? And pray for Alison, or ask him, like, do I go and talk to Alison about this? But it has to be coming back to him, because if I act on my own, then that's dangerous. And if I act on my own, but maybe there were people at school who looked at me like that, and maybe that face, that communication from them has just come back to me, and I've taken that interpretation of them. Again, that is dangerous for mine and her relationship, and it adds to those other voices. All these things kind of build up inside of us. And I just think, I keep saying it, but I just believe it's dangerous to put those interpretation swings on things. And also, I was talking to Daniel the other day, and just doing this is where it becomes dangerous for me, because it's pretty likely when I finish this, you'll have put your own swing on what I've said, and there'll be your own interpretation on what I've said, and I probably haven't meant it. If it's terrible, I really don't think I'll have meant it. Okay, but so there's so much more you could say about other people's voices, but I think my last point is the most important, so I want to go there. But just though, if you're going to interpret it, just take it to Jesus. And that's what I didn't say with the Bible, but that as well. Like, if you want to hear how he said those things to that woman, or any other passage, how he said those things, then you're just going to have to ask him. And you're just going to have to say to him, Jesus, let me hear your voice. I know you said this, but how did you say it? And how do you want me to hear it at this time? And that's all we can do. And that's an amazing thing we can do. We can ask God himself. But I think any other thing, there's too much risk. There's too much at stake to put something. Let these voices come between you and Jesus. And let the voices come between us as well. There's too much at stake here. And then the last voice that we hear is our own voice. But then in my notes I kind of put, hearing your voice, or is it? Because I think that's the big question. Is what we think is our voice, is that really our voice? And the verse that kind of started to stir this up in me a bit is that bit where it says, your enemy the devil prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And I was thinking about, for years I knew that verse. It's quoted quite a lot, but I don't know what I thought he was doing, prowling around. Like, I don't know what he was actually. I think I kind of ignored it. And it says he was like a roaring lion, so he was noisy. He hears his voices, and I never saw it before. But he comes at you with these voices, and I really believe that he makes us believe they're our own. I hope some voices, some things are our own, and some things are genetic, and all these things, layers have built up. But it's what is really our own voice is what God has put there, not what this roaring lion is telling us. And then he roars and he tells us these things, and then someone else does something, and then you might read the Bible and you feel like the Bible's telling you that same thing, and suddenly those voices have become an agreement inside of you. And you've heard different people call it different things, but I call that an agreement. And my best way of explaining this is to give you a little bit of my own story, and I think some of you may already know this, but I'm not going to apologise for it because I still find it interesting, so I kind of get cutie. It's my story. And I can't remember if I may have even said it last time, I'm not sure. But basically what happened is I was beginning to learn about these things, and God brought a memory back to me that had been shoved somewhere deep down low. And it was a memory, this is quite embarrassing telling you, of my first ever French lesson. And I remember you have to do that when you're in year 7, you have to stand up and introduce yourself, and everyone has to know who you are. And I hate all that anyway, and I don't think anyone likes that. But I stood up and I kind of said who I was, and I heard somebody say, Core, she's ugly. And I just remember that so and it was massive, and God brought that memory back to me. And it was really painful because I'd obviously hidden it, but I remembered it when it came, and I knew that I had lived with that voice for those years. I had lived with this hanging over me. And I mean, this is just the grace of God, because it's not that long ago this happened. So I lived here, but I was staying with my mum and dad, and they lived down south, like where I grew up. And the next day, I was going to see my friend Lucy, who is a really dear friend of mine, and she was sitting next to me in that classroom, in that French classroom. She was there when this event had happened, when this Core, she's ugly took place. And the most upsetting thing about that wasn't that someone had said it, because I already believed that anyway about myself, but was that I was sitting in a row of friends, one of which was Lucy, and none of them comforted me when I sat down, and nobody suggested that was wrong. And I was like, that's what really hurt. So I had the memory, that's what really, they must have believed it's true, and they must have believed it was so true that they weren't even going to support me in this. That's what it told me. But by God's grace, I went to see Lucy the day after, and Lucy is a Christian, so she didn't think I was completely mad telling her about all this and asking her. And I said to her, Lucy, why didn't you defend me? And she just looked me in the eye and she said, I think that never happened. And you could argue she had forgotten or whatever, but I believe her because I believe God was in that moment. And she was like, that didn't happen, of course we'd have done something. And for those years, and it really, something in me was like, that is amazing, that is the grace of God, and I have to do something about this because I've heard that voice. And upon that voice, and that voice had come upon other voices from my childhood anyway, but that Core, she's ugly had become this massive thing I'd believed, and it had come, I remember I had a friend who had accidentally built on this one. I showed her a necklace I had, and it was one I really liked, and she had called it masculine, and she hadn't meant anything horrible by it, she was just making an observation. But for me, that being called masculine was like, oh, there it is, there's an agreement. And I read the Bible, and there's those bits about don't braid your hair, or don't worry about braiding your hair, and don't worry about what you wear. So suddenly that became like this, it's okay to be ugly anyway, you shouldn't even care, of course you're ugly, and it doesn't matter, and you're not allowed to do anything about it. And all this piled up on top of me, and became sort of this ruling factor in my life. This Core, she's ugly was massive, and it had to be stopped. And the first way it was stopped was, and this is where it's important because your messages will be different, or they might be the same, but you'll carry these agreements, and if you haven't ever asked God to show you, and there'll be layers of it anyway, so you might as well ask again, but of those agreements that you've made. I remember Daniel said something a few weeks ago that's really stayed with me, where someone told Daniel he had big feet when he was in primary school, and so he wouldn't wear sandals or something like that. And I thought, there is one of those agreements, and it feels so subtle, but it kind of rules us, until Alison, I think, came along and broke that one for him. But we listen to this stuff, these voices, we take them, and we just shouldn't. So the first place I turned was to Song of Solomon. And I had read Song of Solomon before, but just kind of read through it and kind of passed over it. But I lived in Song of Solomon for about 3 years because I had to be intentional in this. I had to break this. And the Song of Solomon is just full of all that stuff about calling you. I don't know if it affects a man in quite the same way. I don't know. But for a woman, the whole kind of my darling. And there's a bit, one of my favourites, it says, show me your face, let me hear your voice, for your face is sweet and your voice is lovely. No, it's wrong word. Your voice is sweet and your face is lovely. And like as a worship leader as well, that's massive, being told your voice is sweet. But I thought, actually, the liar, Satan, is the prince of lies, isn't he? And I don't believe that stuff. So if I believe God, and I believe the Song of Solomon, and I believe the tone that I think the Song of Solomon is talking to that woman in, and I will take that on board. And I'm sure in the Bible, for whatever agreement you've made, there is stuff that you have to, that will, if you ask God for his interpretation and his tone of that he will show you, and he will show that that's broken. But I have to admit that I don't think that alone is enough. I think we can hammer ourselves with this, just believe the word of God, just believe the word of God. And that is brilliant. And like I say, I camped out in Song of Solomon for about 3 years, and I go back there a lot now when this raises its head again. And I just live there, and it's not to undermine the Bible by any means, but I think if that is the only, there is more as well. And I don't understand this side of it. I haven't understood kind of more the spiritual realm, that battle that Lindsay was talking about for a very long time. But I know this works because I've done it over and over again now since I've discovered these agreements. And what I will now do is I know that agreement I've made, that Core, she's ugly, is like a strong man within me. And the Bible says, how can one enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods except he first binds the strong man. So I will literally pray a prayer, and this is the simplicity of it, but it worked. And I will just say, I bind this agreement I've made with Cor, she's ugly. And I recently read, to send it through the throne of Jesus. That sounds like a good idea. So then I just say, I will send it to the throne of Jesus because he will deal with it and I can't. And then I ask Jesus, because then there will be this gaping hole. For me, that Cor, she's ugly, left this gaping hole in me for anything to come out. So then I will ask the Holy Spirit to fill that gaping hole. And then I can move on. And it does, and that's as much as I understand of it. That really, and that's as exciting as that prayer gets. But it makes a difference, and I feel like we have to be practical when we speak up here. So that's my kind of to pray that prayer. If there is something that comes that you realise you've had a voice at you, you can pray that, and something changes. And you may need to pray it again and again, but each time something a little bit more will change. If I was still walking in that, I couldn't stand here now. And in fact, I didn't lead worship at that point, because one day I realised that I didn't want to be heard and I didn't want to be seen, and that's a big problem if you're a worship leader. So this had to get broken to move anywhere. So that's my other voice. So, which was kind of my voice, but my voice with the interpretation on that went other ways. Okay. So I just kind of wanted to conclude. I haven't even looked at the time because I'm afraid it just felt important to say all of this. So I'm just going for it. So I'm not sure how I'm doing, but in conclusion, I kind of wanted this really nice little neat diagram because I knew this was coming, and I thought, I could put it up there, this kind of flow chart of here's one voice, here's your voice you hear from the Bible, here's your voice that you hear from other people, here's that internal voice, and if we dislodge one bit, then all will be peace and calm. That was kind of my hope I could produce, but that's not the case, is it? It's totally what Daniel said last time. It is chaos out there. It is it is a bombardment. We're under fire from these voices. They are coming at us. And then I suddenly thought, come on now. There is a bit in the Bible where God has already pointed this out. There is this massive place. And you'll have heard this as well. And I knew, this is one of those places where I knew I wasn't quite getting it. And I think I only got it last night, really. Or got some of what this says. And it's in 1 Kings 19, verse, I haven't got the right verse, I don't think, 11. Yeah, verse 11 to 13, I think I read. That's 1 Kings 19. Okay, it says, "The Lord said, 'Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by.' Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" And I've read that loads of times, and you'll have heard people preach about that. But I think that is God showing us in a physical way what these voices do when they come at us. Because Elijah stood there, and there were the other voices that are coming at him. So there was the earthquake, and there was the wind, and there was the fire. And I think in the past I've read that in this kind of, as if that moved as quickly as I read it. So here went the earthquake, here went the wind, here went the fire. So it wasn't that big deal for Elijah. He was okay. And actually it's not, is it? And I was thinking about, it's a bit different, but I remember Adam telling me about one of his first mountaineering trips, and he was in an electric storm. And there was he had his metal ice axes in the back, and they're like, and Adam didn't really tell me about this in a particularly frightening way, but to me it sounds pretty horrific. And it was the same, it just kind of conjured this same thought to me of Elijah was in that storm, where Adam was when he was on that mountain. Elijah was on this mountain, and here comes the earthquake, and it's massive, and here comes the wind, and it's massive, and here comes the fire, and he really feels the heat of that fire. Like, I assume he sweated, and it's probably quite frightening, and it's all coming at him. And actually those attacks, if he had stood in those attacks, in that wind and in that earthquake, it would have taken him out. He could have killed him, for goodness sake. It wasn't as quick as I read that in the Bible. It wasn't this kind of, oh, that's nice, and then came still voice. It's massive. And it could have taken him out. Like that, our enemy, the devil, prowls around looking for whom he may devour. And that could have devoured Elijah. Those physical things could have devoured him. But he knew what to do. When that still small voice came, he stepped out in that. And he heard that, even though it was a still small voice, he stepped there and he heard it louder than he'd heard the other voices. And I really think that's what God kind of wants to leave you with, that then just keep asking him and keep listening to
Yeah.
him and just keep reading his word and keep asking what his tone is to you in his
Yeah.
word. Keep not listening to those other voices, or at least not putting your own interpretation on it, and just stand in his voice.
Yes.
And don't necessarily think, just because you can hear the other voices going on, like Elijah could hear the wind and the storm and the earthquake and all that, it doesn't mean you're wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've just got to put your hood up like Elijah and step out in his voice.
Yeah.
That's me.